Before the chandelier above the marble staircase finished its slow, indifferent swing, before the security cameras blinked their red eyes in unison, before the housekeeper down the hall could finish folding the last of the linen towels, a small girl in a faded yellow dress did something no one in that mansion had ever seen anyone do for the man on the floor. She knelt beside him. She pressed her own inhaler into his shaking hand, and she whispered, "It's my last one, but you need it more." 20 feet away, his head of security stopped breathing, because men like Corbin Vance did not collapse, men like Corbin Vance did not gasp, and men like Corbin Vance had certainly never, in 53 years of a life carved out of fear, been saved by a child whose name he didn't even know. The Vance estate sat at the top of Ridgewater Hollow, a gated stretch of land carved into the limestone bluffs above the Pellington River, where the wind moved differently than it did in the rest of the city. The air had a thinner, cleaner quality, the kind that belonged to old money and newer power, and the houses were spaced far enough apart that you could go entire weeks without hearing another human voice. The estate itself was 40,000 square feet of creamstone and dark slate, with hedges trimmed into perfect rectangles and a long curving drive lined with cypress trees. There was a fountain at the front entrance that had not run in 7 years because Corbin had grown to dislike the sound of running water. The estate had a quality of curated emptiness about it, the kind of place where every object had been chosen, but nothing had been loved. The staff entrance sat around the back, past the service drive and the small employee parking lot. This was the door Marisol Quinnell came through every morning at 5:45 sharp, 6 days a week, for the past 2 years and 4 months. It was October now, and the morning light came in low and gray through the kitchen window, and the floors of the back service hallway were always cold. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and lemon polish, and something else underneath. A smell that lived in houses where money had silenced everything except itself. Marisol had chosen this job because it was the only one within 40 miles that paid in cash on Fridays and didn't ask too many questions about her last name. She was 34 years old, though most people guessed older. She had black hair that she kept in a single low braid down her back, secured with a thin elastic she'd had since before her daughter was born. Her eyes were a deep, unusual hazel, the color of river stones in shallow water, and when she was tired, which was almost always, the skin beneath them took on the faint, bruised tone of a woman who had stopped sleeping properly years ago. She wore a pale gray uniform with white piping at the collar, and on the inside of the collar, in a place no one would ever see, she had stitched her daughter's initial in red thread. A single letter. P. For Pemberley. Pemberley Quennell was 6 years old. She had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's narrow face, though her father had been gone for almost 5 years now, and Marisol rarely allowed herself to think about him. Pemberley had brown hair that curled at the ends. She had a small gap between her 2 front teeth that she covered with her hand when she laughed. She wore glasses with thin pink frames, and the left lens had a hairline crack in the corner that Marisol had been promising to replace for 3 months. She had a stuffed elephant named Peabody that she carried everywhere, even at 6 years old. Pemberley had asthma. Severe asthma. The kind that landed her in the emergency room twice in her first year of life, and had given Marisol a permanent mistrust of cold mornings and dust and dogs and high pollen counts. She'd been on a daily controller medication since she was 3, and a rescue inhaler since she was 4, and the rescue inhaler was the most important object in their small lives. It lived in a bright orange canister with a child-sized mouthpiece, and it had to be replaced every 2 months, and the cost without insurance was $87 per refill at the pharmacy, 3 blocks from the studio apartment they rented above a tailor's shop on Hennick Street. Marisol had not had insurance in 3 years. This morning, the inhaler in her daughter's small canvas backpack was the last full one they owned. The replacement Marisol had ordered from a discount mail-order pharmacy was supposed to arrive yesterday. It had not arrived. Today was different from every other Tuesday, only because today was the morning Pemberley had insisted on coming with her. The school had been closed for a teacher's training day. Marisol had no money for a sitter. She had no relatives in this state. She had no friends who could watch a 6-year-old asthmatic child for 10 hours. She had called the staffing agency at midnight and begged them to let her bring Pemberley to the estate just for the day. The agency manager, a tired woman named Doreen, had sighed for a long time and then said, "Just don't let Mr. Vance see her. He doesn't like children in the house." So this morning Pemberley had come with her on the first bus, and Marisol had set her daughter up at the small wooden table in the staff break room with a coloring book and a juice box. She had whispered, "You stay here. You don't move from this chair unless you need the bathroom. And if you feel tight, you use your inhaler immediately. Do you understand me, baby?" Pemberley had nodded. She always nodded. And then Marisol had gone to begin the morning rounds in the east wing of the house, where the boss took his coffee at 7, and where the sound of his footsteps on the marble floors was the only thing that ever broke the long, curated silence of his life. She did not know yet that her daughter would not stay in that chair. Marisol moved through the east wing the way she always did, with the practiced silence of a woman who had learned long ago that being noticed was rarely a gift. And while her hands worked, her mind drifted backward, the way it always did when the house was quiet. She thought about Renton. Renton Quinnell had been 26 when she met him, and 28 when he married her, and 31 when he disappeared with a duffel bag full of cash that didn't belong to him. He had been charming in the way that dangerous men are charming, with a smile that arrived a half-second before it should have. Marisol had been 23, working the register at a hardware store in a town called Auburn Glen, Oklahoma, and Renton had walked in to buy a roll of duct tape and a pack of cigarettes. And he had looked at her the way no one had ever looked at her before. 3 weeks later, they were living together. 6 months later, they were married. 2 years later, Pemberley was born in the back of a Honda Civic on the side of Route 11 because Renton had been too drunk to drive Marisol to the hospital. Marisol had not understood then what kind of man she had married. She had begun to understand before Pemberley was old enough to walk. The duct tape that began to make sense. The cash he sometimes brought home in plastic grocery bags. The men who came to the door at midnight. The phone calls he took in the bathroom with the water running. The look in his eyes the night she had asked the wrong question, the colder silence the night she had asked it twice. He had not been a mafia man, not really. He had been a courier for people who worked for people, the kind of man who took risks for paychecks that never quite let him sleep. And when he disappeared with the duffel bag, Marisol had understood almost immediately that the people he had stolen from would eventually come looking. Not for him. They would come looking for the only forwarding address he had left behind. Her. She had taken Pemberley and left Auburn Glen the same week, with $300 and a car seat and a daughter who was barely walking. She had moved 4 times in the first year. She had stopped using her real last name, going instead by Marisol Hardy, because Hardy had been her mother's name. She had picked up cleaning jobs in motels and offices, and she had taught Pemberley from the very beginning to be quiet, to be invisible, to never tell strangers their full name. 2 years and 4 months ago, she had answered a classified ad pinned to the bulletin board at a laundromat in Pellington. The ad had been placed by an agency that supplied domestic staff to the homes of wealthy private clients in Ridgewater Hollow. The pay was better than anything she had ever made. The agency did not require a social security number for the day of hire paperwork. She had taken the job. She had been assigned to the Vance estate. She had told no one her full name. She had told no one her daughter existed. For 2 years and 4 months, she had walked through these halls and she had cleaned the marble and polished the silver, and she had never once spoken to Mr. Vance directly. The agency had been clear from the beginning. Mr. Vance did not know his housekeepers' names. Mr. Vance did not want to know. The truth was, Marisol had been grateful for that. A man who did not want to know her name was a man who could not tell anyone she was here. But 3 weeks ago, she had received a phone call at the studio apartment on Hennick Street from a number she did not recognize. A man's voice, low and unhurried, had asked for her by her real married name. She had hung up. The phone had rung again 20 minutes later. She had not answered. She had spent the rest of that night sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, with Pemberley asleep beside her, and she had understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that the clock had finally run out. She had begun saving cash from her Friday envelopes inside a coffee tin on top of the refrigerator. $800 now. She needed 2,000. She had given herself until the end of October. She did not yet know that the morning of October 14th would not wait for her plans. She glanced at her wristwatch. 6:52. The boss would be down for coffee in 8 minutes. She gathered her cleaning cart and pushed it quietly toward the service elevator. She did not yet hear the sound of small footsteps 3 corridors away, where her daughter, who had finished her coloring book in 20 minutes, had decided to take Peabody for a quiet walk along the polished floors of a house she had never seen before. Corbin Vance came down the staircase at 6:59, exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, the way he had come down every staircase of every house he had ever owned for the past 30 years. He was a man who measured his life in small precisions, because the larger architecture of it had been so chaotic for so long that the small things had become his only reliable comfort. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie. His shoes had been shined the night before by a man whose name he did not know. His hair, once black, was now silver at the temples in a way that would have looked deliberate if it weren't entirely accidental. He was 53 years old. He had been the head of the Vance organization for 29 of those years. He owned legitimate construction companies, a shipping consortium, 3 restaurants, and a small private bank in the next state. He owned other things, too. Things that did not appear on any document. He had done things in his earlier years that he could never undo. Things he had stopped counting somewhere in his mid-30s, because counting them had begun to feel like a form of pride. He walked into the breakfast solarium at the east end of the house, where the morning light came through the tall windows and fell across the white linen tablecloth, and he sat in his usual chair, and he reached for the coffee pot. He poured the coffee. He took a single sip, and then his throat closed. It was not the first time. He had been having episodes for almost 6 months now. His doctor, a careful man named Halverson, had diagnosed it as a rare, adult-onset bronchospastic condition triggered by stress and certain food sensitivities. Corbin had not told the doctor everything. He had not told the doctor that the episodes had started the same week he had received a particular phone call from a man he had once considered his closest friend. He had not told the doctor that the episodes were getting worse. This morning, the episode came faster than it ever had. The coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. His chest seized. His vision narrowed at the edges. He tried to stand, and his knees gave out, and he went down hard against the side of the table, and the sound of the crash echoed through the solarium and into the long marble hallway beyond. He could not breathe. He clawed at his collar. He tried to call out and produced no sound. He could see the edges of the room beginning to tilt, and a thought arrived in his mind with strange clarity, a thought that he had not had in almost 40 years, a thought that belonged to a younger version of himself, a boy of 11, in a small apartment above a gas station, watching his older sister have an asthma attack in the kitchen because their mother had not been able to afford the medicine that month. His sister's name had been Ardennes. She had died when he was 12. He had not allowed himself to say her name out loud in nearly 40 years, and then, through the narrowing tunnel of his vision, he saw a small figure appear in the doorway of the solarium, a little girl in a faded yellow dress. Hazel eyes behind pink-framed glasses with a hairline crack in the left lens. Brown curls escaping from a tight braid. A stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. She did not scream. She did not run. She walked toward him with the calm, steady purpose of a child who had been managing a pair of failing lungs since before she could read. She knelt beside him on the marble floor. She set her stuffed elephant down carefully on the linen. She unzipped the small canvas backpack. She pulled out a bright orange canister with a child-sized mouthpiece, and she said in a voice softer than the morning light, "Mister, I'm going to help you. You have to breathe with me, okay?" She placed the inhaler against his mouth. She pressed the canister. She counted to 4, the way her mother had taught her. Slowly, out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then she pressed it a second time, and counted again. And on the third press she leaned in close to his ear and whispered the words that, 20 feet down the hall, Sullivan Reiki had stopped breathing to hear. "It's my last one, but you need it more." Corbin Vance felt his lungs open. He felt the air come back into his chest in a great, ragged pull, like a man surfacing from a long dive into cold water. He turned his head slowly, and he looked at the little girl whose entire life he had just been given by. And he saw on the inside of her glasses the faint reflection of her own face, calm and serious, and terribly, impossibly tired in a way no 6-year-old face should have been. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the door he had walled off nearly 40 years ago, the door he had built brick by brick over the ghost of a sister named Ardennes, made a single quiet sound. It cracked. Sullivan Reiki reached them in 11 seconds. He was a man of 48, broad through the shoulders, with a shaved head, and the kind of gray eyes that had been trained over 20 years to register a room in fragments before the rest of his mind could catch up. He had been Corbin Vance's head of security for the past 9 years, and before that, he had spent 11 years in a federal protection detail. And before that, he had spent 6 years in a war that he had never described to anyone, including his wife. He had not expected the something terrible to be a small girl in a yellow dress. He came around the corner of the solarium with his hand already inside his jacket, and he saw Corbin on the floor, and he saw the child kneeling beside him, and his hand stopped moving. The child had just, in the most literal sense possible, saved the life of the most dangerous man in Pellington County. "Sir," Sullivan said. "Sir, are you with me?" Corbin lifted one hand slightly off the floor. "A signal. I'm here." Sullivan moved closer. He knelt on Corbin's other side. He did not touch the child. He simply waited. "Once more, mister," Pemberley said softly. "One more time. My mom says 3 times if it's a really bad one." She pressed the canister a third time. Corbin's chest rose, held, released. The color began to return to his face. "What's your name?" Corbin asked. His voice was a rasp, but it was his. The little girl looked at him. She seemed to weigh the question carefully, the way she weighed every question. "Pemberley," she said finally. "I'm not supposed to be here. Please don't tell." "Pemberley what?" "Just Pemberley?" "Where's your mother, Pemberley?" "She works here, she cleans. But school is closed today, so I'm supposed to stay in the break room. But I finished my coloring book and Peabody wanted to see the rest of the house." She paused. Her small hand tightened around the strap of her backpack. "Please don't make her lose her job. Please. We need the money. She's saving up." "Saving up for what?" Pemberley's hazel eyes went very still behind the cracked pink lens of her glasses. She did not answer. She had been taught not to answer. Corbin Vance had spent 53 years of his life watching people decide whether to tell him the truth. He had developed, over those decades, a particular ear for the silences that came before lies, and the silences that came before secrets, and the silence that came out of this small girl in a faded yellow dress was the second kind. She was not lying to him. She was protecting someone. "Pemberley," he said. His voice was gentler than it had been in years. "I'm not going to make your mother lose her job. I promise you that. But I need you to do one more thing for me. I need you to sit with Mr. Reike here. He's a friend. He's going to make sure you're safe. I'm going to find your mother. Is that all right? She looked at Sullivan. Sullivan, who had been called many things in his life but never a friend and never quite like that, found himself nodding at the child with a slowness that surprised him. Pemberley considered him for a long moment. Then she nodded back. Okay, she said, but Peabody stays with me. Peabody stays with you, Corbin said. He pulled himself upright slowly. He stood. He straightened his suit jacket. He looked down at the little girl on the marble floor of his breakfast solarium, the little girl whose name he had now heard spoken 3 times. Pemberley. He turned and walked out of the solarium and into the long marble hallway, with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had just remembered something he had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. He had been 12 years old when Ardennes died. Their mother had worked 2 jobs, a laundry on the West Side, and a night shift at a hospital that paid her in cash because she did not have the right papers. Their father had been gone since Corbin was 4. Ardennes had been 15 and asthmatic and brilliant, the kind of girl who had taught herself to read in 2 languages and who had wanted, more than anything else in the world, to become a nurse. The inhaler she had needed had cost $42 at the pharmacy on Arnett Street, and there had been 3 weeks that autumn when their mother had not been able to afford it. And on the morning of October 19th, Ardennes had had an attack at the kitchen table, and there had been no inhaler in the house, and Corbin had run 6 blocks in the rain to the pharmacy, and by the time he had come back, his sister had already gone still in their mother's arms. He had never told anyone the date, not his wife, who had left him after 11 years, not Bram Hollister, who had betrayed him 3 months ago, not even Sullivan, who had been with him for 9 years. He had not said the name Ardennes out loud in nearly 40 years. And now, somewhere in the staff wing of a 40,000-square-foot estate, a 6-year-old girl named Pemberley had just used her last inhaler on him, and her mother was somewhere in this house, and she did not yet know what had happened. Corbin Vance reached the end of the long marble hallway. He stopped. He pulled out his phone. He sent a single message to Sullivan. Find the mother. Bring her to me. Don't frighten her. He paused for a long moment, his thumb hovering above the screen. Then he typed 3 more words and sent them. Replace that inhaler. Today. Marisol was on the 2nd-floor landing polishing the bronze handrail when Sullivan Reike found her. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the footsteps of a man who did not bother to hide that he was coming. She straightened slowly, the polishing cloth still in her hand, and she turned her head. And she saw the head of security walking toward her, with an expression she could not read, and her body did the thing it had taught itself to do over the past 3 weeks. It went still. The kind of stillness that prey animals use when they have already calculated the distance to the nearest exit, and have already understood that the exit is not close enough. Mrs. Quinnell, Sullivan said. He used her real name. Marisol's hand tightened around the cloth. She had not given that name to anyone in this house. The name on her staff badge said Hardy. The name in the agency file said Hardy. Mrs. Quinnell, Sullivan said again, more gently, the way a man speaks to a horse he does not want to spook. Your daughter is downstairs in the breakfast solarium. She is safe. She is unharmed. I need you to come with me. My daughter? Yes. My daughter is in the staff break room. I left her there an hour ago. She's not there now. She's downstairs, with Mr. Vance. The cloth fell out of Marisol's hand. She moved past Sullivan before he could finish his next sentence. She did not run. She walked, very fast, with the contained, efficient motion of a woman whose body had been preparing for a moment like this for 2 years and 4 months. She came down the back staircase, along the service corridor, around the corner into the breakfast solarium, and she stopped in the doorway, and she saw her daughter. Pemberley was sitting on the marble floor next to a man in a charcoal suit. The stuffed elephant was in her lap. There was a glass of water in Pemberley's small hand. The man in the charcoal suit was sitting on the floor too, with his back against the leg of the dining table, in a position no one had ever seen Corbin Vance occupy before. He looked up when Marisol came into the doorway. For a long moment, no one spoke. Marisol's eyes went from her daughter to the man on the floor and back to her daughter, and her body began the small, involuntary shaking that happens when a system has been holding too much for too long. She did not cry. She simply shook, very slightly, and she said her daughter's name. Pemberley. Mama, the man got sick. Like me. So I helped him. I used my inhaler. You used... It's okay. I know we don't have any more. But he was turning blue, Mama. He was turning blue. Marisol crossed the room in 3 quick steps. She knelt beside her daughter. She pulled Pemberley into her arms, and she pressed her face into the brown curls at the top of her daughter's head, and she held her. She did not look at Corbin Vance. She knew he was looking at her. Mrs. Quennell, he said. His voice was not the voice she had imagined a man like him would have. She had heard fragments of it over the past 2 years, from the upper hallways. It had always sounded like a voice that had been carved out of granite. Right now it sounded like a voice that had been speaking softly to a child for several minutes, and had not yet remembered to harden itself again. My name is Corbin Vance. I want you to know that your daughter is not in any trouble. Neither are you. What she did this morning saved my life, and I am, at this moment, in her debt, in a way that I do not yet know how to describe. Marisol lifted her face from her daughter's hair. How do you know my name? It was not a question. It was the flat, careful statement of a woman who had just realized that the ground beneath her feet was not where she thought it was. Sullivan looked you up while I was talking to Pemberley, Corbin said. I asked him to. Your real name was on the agency's secondary file. I want to apologize for that. I had to know who was in my house. I did not have to use the full name. That was a mistake. I'm sorry. Marisol stared at him. Apologies were a thing that men in her life had not given her. The man in the charcoal suit on the floor of the breakfast solarium had given her one in the first 30 seconds of meeting her, and she did not know what to do with it. I have to go, she said. Her voice cracked. I have to take her. We have to go. Mrs. Quennell. I can't be here. You don't understand. I can't be here. I understand more than you think I do. Please, sit down. Just for a moment. Let me say one thing. And then, if you want to leave, Sullivan will drive you home, and you will never have to come back to this house again. I will pay your full salary for the year. I will give you a reference under whatever name you like. But please, one moment. Marisol did not sit down, but she did not leave either. My sister had asthma, Corbin said. He did not say it the way men say important things. He said it the way men say things that have been sitting in their mouths for a long time. Her name was Ardennes. She was 15 years old. We could not afford her inhaler one autumn, and she died at our kitchen table on the morning of October 19th. I have not said her name out loud in nearly 40 years. Today is October 14th. 5 days from now will be the anniversary of her death. And this morning, on the floor of this room, your daughter gave me the medicine that no one was able to give my sister. He paused. I am asking you to sit down. Not because I want anything from you, because I would like you to know that I understand exactly what your daughter just did. And I would like you to understand that you and your daughter are, from this moment, under the protection of this house. Whatever you are running from, whoever has been calling your phone at night, those things are no longer your problem alone. Marisol's eyes filled. She had not cried in 11 months. She sat down on the marble floor with her daughter in her arms. Corbin had the staff move them to the small library on the first floor. It was the only room in the house that had ever felt like a room to him. The other rooms had been designed by other people, decorated by other people, photographed for magazines that Corbin had never read. The small library was the only space he had assembled himself, slowly, with books he had actually opened, and a leather chair that had belonged to his grandfather, and a fireplace that worked. He had certainly never invited a child into it. He invited them both now. A young woman from the kitchen, whose name was Enola Brecht, and who had worked at the estate for 4 years, brought a tray of hot chocolate and 2 plates of buttered toast and a small bowl of cut strawberries. She smiled at the little girl in the yellow dress in the way that adults sometimes smile at children when they are trying to communicate, without words, that the world is larger and kinder than the child has been led to believe. Pemberley smiled back, hesitantly, with her small hand over the gap in her teeth. Sullivan stood by the door. He did not sit. Corbin sat in the chair across from Marisol. He did not pour the hot chocolate. He let her pour it, because he had understood that this was a woman who needed to do things for herself in order to feel that she was still standing on her own ground. Marisol poured the hot chocolate. She handed it to Pemberley. "Mama," Pemberley said softly, "are we in trouble?" "No, baby." "Are we leaving?" "I don't know yet. I'm a little sleepy." "Drink your chocolate." Pemberley drank. Marisol looked at Corbin. "You said you understand," she said. Her voice was low, steady. "What did you mean?" Corbin set his hands on his knees. "I meant that I have been receiving phone calls too," he said. She blinked. "For 3 months. From a man I once trusted. He was my closest associate for 17 years. His name is Bram Hollister. 3 months ago, he tried to take something from me that did not belong to him, and when I stopped him, he did not run. He stayed in this city. Last week I learned that he has been compiling information on the people who work in this house. Background checks, photographs, names that were not supposed to be in any file. He found your name somewhere he should not have." Marisol's hand froze on the handle of her own cup. "What?" "Your secondary file at the agency was accessed 2 weeks ago by an outside party. Sullivan flagged it 3 days ago. We did not yet know whose file it was. This morning, when Sullivan looked up your name to bring you to me, he saw the flag on your file. The man who pulled your record was Bram Hollister." The library was very quiet. Pemberley had set down her hot chocolate. She was looking at her mother with the careful, watchful expression that Corbin had come to recognize as the look of a child who had spent her whole life listening to grown-up conversations she was not supposed to understand. "I don't know who that is," Marisol said. "I don't know that name." "He doesn't know you either. That is not the point. The point is that he was looking for a vulnerability, and he found one in this house. And the vulnerability he found was a woman whose real name does not match her staff badge. The phone calls you have been receiving on Hennick Street. Those calls are not from your husband's old associates. Those calls are from Bram Hollister. He has been trying to confirm that you are who you are." Marisol pressed her hand over her mouth. For a long moment she did not speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely audible. "My husband stole money from people I never met," she said. "I have been running from those people for almost 5 years. I have moved 4 times. I have changed my name. I have not let anyone know my daughter exists. I took this job because the agency did not ask me too many questions, and now you are telling me that the man you are at war with has been the one calling me. Not them. You." "Yes. My daughter saved your life this morning." "Yes. And the person who has been hunting me is hunting me because of you." Corbin lowered his head slightly. He did not look away from her. He simply lowered his head, the way men do when they accept a charge that has been laid against them honestly. "Yes," he said, "and I am going to fix it." Marisol let out a small sound. It was not a laugh. It was not a sob. It was the sound of a woman who had been holding a long breath for almost 5 years and had just been told that the breath had been pointed in the wrong direction the entire time. Pemberley reached up and put her small hand on her mother's wrist. "Mama," she said, "drink your chocolate." Marisol looked down at her daughter, at the cracked pink lens of her glasses, at the brown curls escaping from the morning's braid. "Mr. Vance," Marisol said. She did not look up. "What happens now?" "Now," Corbin said. "You do not go back to Hennick Street. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until this is over. There is a guest cottage on the south side of this property. It has its own entrance. It has a security door with a deadbolt and a separate alarm code that I will set up in your name. You and your daughter will stay there until I have finished what I am about to finish. You will be paid for every day. You will not work. You will rest. A doctor will come to the cottage tomorrow morning to examine her. Whatever she needs, she will have. New inhalers, the controller medication, a nebulizer for the cottage. The cost is not your concern. It is mine." Marisol's tears finally fell. They fell quietly, with the slow steadiness of a woman who had been refusing them for a very long time. They fell into the cup of hot chocolate she had not yet touched. They fell onto the cuff of her gray uniform with the white piping. Pemberley turned her face up toward her mother. "Mama, don't cry. I'm not sad, baby." "Then why?" "Because someone is being nice to us. And I forgot what that felt like." Pemberley considered this for a long moment. Then she nodded, the way she always nodded, with the small gravity of a child who had decided that the answer made sense. She picked up her hot chocolate again. She drank. Across the room, by the door, Sullivan Reiki turned his head slightly toward the window so that no one in the library would see his face. The guest cottage sat at the south end of the estate, separated from the main house by a long flagstone path that wound through a small grove of birch trees. It had been built 30 years ago by Corbin's grandfather, who had lived in it for the last 8 years of his own life because the main house had grown too quiet for him after his wife passed. It was a single-story structure of warm brown stone with 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen with copper pots hanging above the stove, and a back porch that looked out over a meadow that had been allowed to grow wild. The cottage had not been used in 7 years. Enola Brecht and 2 other members of the kitchen staff spent the early afternoon cleaning it, opening windows to air it out, and putting fresh sheets on the beds. Sullivan personally walked the perimeter twice. He installed a new alarm panel. He set the access code to a number that only he and Marisol would ever know. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Marisol and Pemberley were in the cottage. Pemberley fell asleep on the smaller of the 2 beds within 20 minutes of arriving. She was still wearing the yellow dress. Peabody was tucked under her arm. Marisol sat on the edge of the bed for a long time and watched her daughter breathe. The breathing was even, steady. The kind of breathing that came from a child whose body had finally believed, for the first time in a long time, that it was safe to rest. Marisol covered her with the blanket and walked out into the sitting room. Corbin was waiting there. He was no longer in the charcoal suit. He had changed into a dark sweater and pressed slacks, and he was holding 2 cups of tea. He set one of them down on the side table next to the leather armchair across from him. He did not say anything. He waited for Marisol to choose where to sit. She sat in the armchair. She picked up the tea. "Is she asleep?" he asked. "Yes." "Good. The doctor's name is Halverson. He'll be here at 8 tomorrow morning. He treats my own condition. He is discreet. He will not log her under your real name unless you ask him to." "Thank you." "Marisol." It was the first time he had used her first name. She looked at him. "What I am about to do over the next several days will be done regardless of you. You are not asking me for anything, and I am not doing anything for you that requires anything from you in return. The man who has been calling your phone is a man I should have finished 3 months ago. I did not. I waited. I told myself that patience was wisdom. The truth is that I had let a wound go untreated because treating it required me to be the man I was 20 years ago, and I did not want to be that man anymore. This morning, your daughter handed me an inhaler on the floor of my breakfast solarium, and I understood in the 7 seconds before I could breathe again that I had let my comfort cost other people their safety. The correction is happening now because I am no longer permitted, in my own conscience, to delay it. Marisol was quiet. What does the correction look like? She finally said. It looks like phone calls, meetings, the ending of an arrangement that I should have ended in July. It does not look like anything you will ever need to see, hear, or carry the weight of. By the end of this week, Bram Hollister will have left this state of his own choosing. He will not call you again. The agency will not have your file again. I am buying the agency. Sullivan made the call an hour ago. Marisol set down her tea. You are buying the agency. To fix every file. She stared at him. There is one more thing, Corbin said. Your husband. Marisol's spine went straight. Renton Quinnell took approximately $48,000 from a courier route operated by a small organization based out of Tulsa. That organization spent 18 months looking for him. They stopped looking 8 months ago, when they received credible information that Renton had died of an overdose in a motel in New Mexico. The death was confirmed by the local coroner. The body was never claimed because no one knew his real legal name. They are no longer looking for you. They have not been looking for you in over a year. The phone calls you have been receiving on Hennick Street are not from them. They are from Bram Hollister. Marisol pressed her hands flat against the arms of the chair. She did not speak for a long time. She had been running from a ghost. She had been moving her daughter from town to town, school to school, name to name, for a ghost that had stopped chasing her months ago, and she had not known, because she had no one to tell her, because the architecture of her isolation had been so complete that the news of her own freedom had never been able to find her. How do you know all of that? She finally said. I made phone calls while you were in the cottage. I have known the people in Tulsa for 20 years. I have it in writing now. I will give you the document tomorrow. Marisol began to laugh. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had just been told that the prison she had been sitting in had had its door unlocked the whole time, and she had simply never tried it. The laugh broke into crying, and the crying broke into the sound a person makes when they have finally been allowed to put down something they did not realize they had been carrying with both hands. Corbin did not move. He did not reach for her. He sat very still in his own chair and let her have the room. When she was finished, she wiped her face with the cuff of her sleeve. What do I do now? She said softly. You sleep in a real bed tonight. You let the doctor see your daughter tomorrow. You stay in this cottage for as many days as you need, and when you are ready, we will sit down at this same table, and we will talk about what comes next. Whatever you choose, you will not be choosing it alone. He stood up. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, and he turned, and he looked back at her one more time. Thank you, he said, for raising the kind of daughter who would do what she did this morning. I do not know how you did it, given what you have been carrying. I only know that you did. He opened the door. He walked out into the long afternoon light. The door closed quietly behind him. In the small bedroom at the end of the hall, Pemberley turned over in her sleep, and her stuffed elephant rolled with her, and the cottage settled into the kind of silence that had not been heard inside it for 7 years. The silence of a house that someone was finally living in again. The week that followed unfolded in a series of quiet, deliberate motions, the way a clock unwinds when its weights have been correctly set. Dr. Halverson arrived at 8 the next morning. He spent 90 minutes with Pemberley. He listened to her lungs. He measured her peak flow. He reviewed her medication history with Marisol in the small kitchen of the cottage. By the end of the visit, Pemberley had a new daily controller medication that was twice as effective as the one she had been using, 2 new rescue inhalers in matching orange canisters, a portable nebulizer, and a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. He set up the nebulizer on the kitchen counter himself, and he showed Pemberley how to use it. And at the end of the demonstration, she said, "Thank you, Dr. Halverson," in the small, clear voice of a child who had been raised by a mother who insisted on manners even when there was nothing else to insist on. Dr. Halverson walked back to his car afterward and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. He did not charge the estate for the visit. He sent only an itemized list of the medications marked at the bottom, personal care for the family. No invoice. By the 3rd day, Marisol had begun to sleep through the night. She woke up on the morning of the 3rd day with her face pressed against an actual pillow, and her first thought was that something was wrong, because she had not slept lying down for more than 4 hours in a row in years. She lay there in the gray morning light of the cottage bedroom, and she heard nothing. No footsteps, no phone ringing. She heard only the soft, even breathing of her daughter in the next room. And she closed her eyes again, and she slept for another 2 hours, because her body had finally been given permission to. By the 5th day, Pemberley had started to laugh again. Marisol had not realized until that moment how rarely her daughter had laughed in the past year. It was Enola who brought it out of her. Enola had been bringing meals to the cottage twice a day, and on the 5th morning she had brought a small cardboard box with 3 kittens in it that someone in her family was trying to find homes for. Pemberley had looked into the box, and her face had done something Marisol had not seen since before they left Auburn Glen, and she had laughed, and the sound of the laugh had carried out through the open kitchen window into the meadow beyond. They did not keep a kitten. The cottage was temporary. But Pemberley spent 45 minutes on the kitchen floor with all 3 of them, and she gave them names, and the names were Marbles and Custard and General Pickles, and Marisol stood in the doorway and watched, and she did not say a single word. On the 6th day, Sullivan came to the cottage with a manila envelope. He sat with Marisol at the kitchen table while Pemberley colored at the small desk by the window. He laid the documents out one by one. The first was a death certificate for Renton Quennell, issued by a county coroner in New Mexico under the alias Renton had been using. The second was a notarized statement from a man in Tulsa, confirming that the organization Renton had stolen from had closed its file on the Quennell matter, and that no member of that organization had any current or future interest in Marisol Quennell or her daughter. The third was a copy of a property deed. The cottage. Quietly placed into a trust. The trustee was Marisol Quennell. The beneficiary was Pemberley Quennell. The trust would mature on Pemberley's 18th birthday. Until that time, Marisol had the unrestricted right to live in the cottage rent-free for as long as she chose. The fourth was a small piece of folded paper, a handwritten note in Corbin's hand. The cottage is yours, whether you stay or leave, whether you ever speak to me again. The deed is in your name because it should be. Nothing about this requires anything from you. KV Marisol stared at the documents for a long time. When she finally raised her face, she said, "Where is he?" "Mr. Vance is finishing the matter with Mr. Hollister this afternoon. Quietly. Mr. Hollister will be on a plane out of the country tomorrow morning. He will not be returning. The agency has been purchased. The files have been corrected. Officially, Mrs. Quennell, you have never worked here." And unofficially. Unofficially, Sullivan said, with a small softening at the corners of his eyes. You saved his life. And he has been a different man this week than I have known him to be in the 9 years I have worked for him. Marisol lowered her face. She did not cry this time. She had cried enough in the past week. What was left was something quieter, something steadier. She picked up the handwritten note. She folded it carefully along the same line Corbin had folded it. She put it in the pocket of her gray uniform. "Mr. Reike," she said, Sullivan, please. Sullivan, tell him thank you. From both of us. Tell him I will say it myself. But tell him now, in case I cannot find the words later. I will tell him, Sullivan said. He gathered the envelope and stood. He paused at the door. He looked back at Pemberley, who was still coloring at the desk, with her tongue stuck slightly out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. He smiled at her. Pemberley did not see him. She was busy giving the cat in her drawing a very small inhaler. Sullivan walked out into the autumn light, and the cottage door clicked softly behind him. 3 months later, on a clear afternoon in mid-January, a small girl in a navy blue coat walked up the long flagstone path through the birch grove with her mother holding her hand. The girl was carrying a folded piece of paper. Her glasses had new frames now, thin tortoiseshell instead of pink, and the lenses were perfectly clear. Her brown curls had been allowed to grow longer. She was wearing a small backpack with a unicorn embroidered on the front. Inside were 2 rescue inhalers, both full, both new, alongside a juice box and a packet of crackers and her stuffed elephant Peabody. Her mother was wearing a charcoal coat over a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans. Her black hair was no longer in the long braid down her back. It had been cut to her shoulders, and there was a small silver pin holding back one side of it that had been a gift from Enola Brecht for her 35th birthday in November. She no longer wore the gray uniform. She still kept it folded in a drawer in the cottage bedroom, on top of the small piece of paper with Corbin's handwriting on it, because some things you kept, not because you needed them, but because you wanted to remember the day you were given the choice not to need them anymore. They had been living in the cottage for 92 days. Marisol had taken a job at the public library in the small town at the foot of Ridgewater Hollow, 3 afternoons a week. The hours allowed her to be home when Pemberley came back from her new school, which had a small classroom and a kind teacher and 3 other children who also had asthma. Pemberley had made a friend. Her name was Honora Lemoyne, and she had red hair and a louder laugh than Pemberley had ever managed, and the 2 of them had decided, in the way that 6-year-olds decide such things, that they were going to be best friends forever. The cottage had become a home, in a way Marisol had not known a place could become. She had started a small garden in the meadow behind the porch. She had hung curtains in the kitchen. Pemberley had a real bed now, in a real bedroom, with a real desk, and on the desk was a row of crayons in their original box. Corbin Vance was on the back terrace of the main house. He was sitting at a small wrought iron table with a glass of water, watching the long winter light move across the meadow. He had not seen Marisol or Pemberley in 9 days. He had been giving them space all winter, because he had understood from the very first afternoon in the cottage that the right thing to do was to let them choose how much of him they wanted in their lives. They had come to the main house twice a month, on average, always at Marisol's invitation. He had never once visited the cottage uninvited. He saw them coming up the path now. He stood up. Pemberley let go of her mother's hand and ran the last 20 feet across the terrace, and she stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath, and she held out the folded piece of paper. "I made you something," she said. "For the anniversary." Corbin looked at her. He did not have to ask which anniversary. He took the folded paper from her small hands. He opened it carefully, the way he opened everything she had ever given him. It was a drawing. There were 3 figures in the drawing. A tall man in a charcoal coat. A woman with shoulder-length black hair. A small girl in a navy blue coat holding a stuffed elephant. They were standing in front of a stone cottage with smoke coming out of the chimney and a single tree beside it. Above the figures, in the unsteady letters of a 6-year-old, Pemberley had written one word in dark green crayon. Family. Corbin Vance, who had run an organization for 29 years, who had buried a sister at the age of 12, who had carried decisions whose names he had since forgotten, who had not allowed himself to feel the weight of his own life since he was old enough to understand that weight could be carried, sat down slowly in the wrought iron chair, and he held the small drawing against his chest, and he closed his eyes for a long moment. Marisol came up the steps to the terrace. She stopped a few feet away. She did not say anything. When Corbin opened his eyes again, he looked at the drawing, and then he looked at Pemberley, and then he looked at Marisol, and he said, "May I keep this?" "It's for you," Pemberley said. "I made it for you." "Then I will keep it always." He stood up. He held the drawing carefully in both hands. He walked back into the house through the open glass doors of the terrace. Marisol watched him cross the long sitting room, walk down the marble hallway, and turn into the small library on the first floor. Through the open door, she saw him cross to the leather chair that had belonged to his grandfather. She saw him kneel beside the small side table next to the chair. She saw him open the drawer of the table, and she saw him place the drawing carefully inside, and she saw him close the drawer, and she saw him rest his hand on top of the table for a long moment before he stood again. She had not known, until that moment, that the drawer of that small side table was empty. She had not known that he had been keeping it empty for 30 years, ever since his grandfather had died, because he had never been able to think of anything that belonged inside it. Pemberley tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, can I go say hi to Enola? She said she's making cookies." "Yes, baby, go." Pemberley ran across the terrace and into the house, and her small footsteps echoed down the marble hallway in the direction of the kitchen. Corbin came back to the terrace. He stood beside Marisol, not too close, with his hands in the pockets of his coat. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Marisol said, very quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not looking away." Corbin did not answer right away. He looked out over the meadow. He looked at the cottage. He looked at the smoke from the chimney rising into the cold, pale blue. "My sister used to draw," he said, "when she was little. She drew our family, before our father left. After she died, I threw all of those drawings away because I could not bear to look at them, and I have regretted it every day since. You have not regretted today." He turned his face toward her. She was looking at him. Her hazel eyes, the color of river stones in shallow water, were calm, and they were tired, and they were also, for the first time in years, entirely unafraid. "I have not regretted any of it," he said. The wind moved across the meadow. The smoke rose from the chimney of the cottage. In the kitchen behind them, a 6-year-old girl with brown curls and tortoise-shell glasses was telling Enola Brecht about 3 kittens she had named in the autumn, and Enola was laughing. And in the small library at the front of the house, in the drawer of a side table that had been empty for 30 years, a single piece of paper waited quietly, with a single word written in dark green crayon at the top, and the door of the room remained gently, deliberately open.